I learned how to use real magic. Well, not really, but I did learn how to use NUKE, which is basically the same thing. The shot here, we have me making a coin disappear. I wanted to show you guys how I did it. So obviously I don't know how to use real magic, but I can show you how to do it using cleanup techniques and painting, which is basically a similar version of what we did to remove that Starbucks coffee cup in the previous video. This will just dive into some slightly more technical parts of painting and prep. So if you haven't seen the video we made before on the channel, I'd recommend going ahead and watching that first and then watching this one, because that one is a simpler version of what we're going to do here. Jumping right into it, the first thing I want to start off with is seeing, does the coin go over anything behind my hand? Because the best way I'd like to deal with any sort of cleanup, any prep paint, is going from the back to front. So anything that's in the background first, I touch that first, and then I will work my way forwards. So in this case, yes, the coin does go over the background. And so what I'm going to do first is find a clean area which isn't obscured by my hand that I can use as a patch and just track it on to the plate that can then cover the coin. So I think around 168 seems to be a good frame, because after that, that's where my hand moves down, and I can create a rotor shape that will not include the hand and won't be obscuring anything. So first thing, we go and create a frame hold node and connect it right to the plate. You might notice me creating my NUKE script a certain way, and I think it'll be useful to make a video later on as to how I like to lay out NUKE scripts and the best practices to do that. My general advice is, as long as it's neat, you can use your own sort of way of doing things, as long as things are flowing downwards, because that's just how it's done in the industry these days. This is what people expect. So if you want to replicate the way I do NUKE scripts, and then as you get more used to it, you can find your own kind of method of doing things, you should go ahead and do that if it makes your life easy. And afterwards, we use a copy and a rotor shape. This is just the same way we did the other video, and it's just going to be using slightly different techniques. So then we're going to create a fairly large area rotor shape that covers vaguely where our coin is going to drop. And then you might want to just feather it so that the patch isn't as noticeable. I like to be safe and create my patches fairly big, and then after I've done the patch, I can refine it to a more smaller space so that we're not patching a large chunk of the plate and we are using as much of the original plate as possible. So then after that, you'd want to go ahead and pre-mult the alpha, and then let's just go ahead and merge over to the plate and see what it looks like. So if we just play the shot as it is, it looks like we've done a pretty good job of tracking in the background. And because there's very minimal movement in the actual background itself, I think we'll be okay with not having to track the background. Usually the best practice is to do a 2D track of the background and then putting that underneath your patch, but in this case I think we'll be safe here. So now you've noticed that the actual patch has obscured the hand, and the way we're going to deal with that is we're just going to do some roto to bring the hand back, and then after the roto we'll layer the hand over that background patch that we've done. So now we do the very fun task of rotoing the hand, and as I've mentioned before, my favorite way of rotoing back elements in the plate is using a key mix. And what you do is just put the key mix under the merge. The A input goes into the plate, the B input will go into the merge that we've done. And then our rotor will be plugged into the mask input here. Now, before I actually go ahead and start the roto, I noticed that we don't actually need this patch to exist before the coin drops. So anything before this frame hold 168, we can just turn it off. So then it'll be using just the plate throughout the whole frame range before our patch. So on 168, because we haven't made any changes to this patch, we can go ahead and turn it off at that frame. So set the keyframe on the mix at 168, go 1 frame back, and we turn it to 0, so that'll turn off the patch. So that will just save us from dealing with any issues happening early on in the frame where if the camera moves, then we don't need to deal with any patchwork beforehand. So we can isolate all within these 15 frames where we actually need to do the work. Cool. So now we go ahead and start the roto. Now, if you want to learn how to do proper detailed roto, we do have a video on the channel where we learned how to roto a box, and that kind of runs through the basic fundamentals on how to do actual roto in NUKE and all the little ways we do QCing. And just if you haven't watched that, I'd highly recommend that before you go into any sort of patching stuff, because the general workflow of how people get jobs in as a roto / paint artist is in some studios, the way it works is you start off as just a roto artist because you're a beginner, and then slowly you get more and more advanced paint tasks later on. So if you can prove yourself to be a good roto artist, then you'll be guaranteed to get some good paint work later on. So it's definitely worth investing time to get good at this. Something you'll notice me doing is flicking back and forth really fast to check how my patch is doing in relation to the rotor, and that'll just help me determine, is my rotor too far in or too far out? And that's just how I do my QC work. Now, anything before 168 we'll just want to turn off because there's nothing there to rotor at all. Now we're going to go ahead and play the footage again, and just to see how it looks. A thing I'd recommend is every time you do a thing in your paint or patch, like once you do your first patch and then you do your roto, each task that you do within the main work, I'd highly recommend just playing the shot afterwards just to see what it looks like. And it's always good to QC your work as you're going rather than doing it all at once and then figuring out what's wrong later on. So as you're going on, you're refining your work, and that'll help with the QC process later on. So if you were to submit this to a supervisor, they won't pick out a lot of issues throughout the shot, and you can kind of have it approved very early on rather than going through revisions. You can see we've done a decent job of rotoing the hand over the patch, and now we need to move on to patching the hand over the coin. This is where the bulk of the work is going to be, and this is why I wanted to make the tutorial, because it's not a very typical kind of patch, because it's going to require a number of techniques, and I think this example is going to be the best way to teach you guys on a lot of different techniques, on different ways that prep artists do their work. So the first thing I wanted to do is do the main bulk patch, which is going to be this palm area. I noticed that my fingers move a little bit while the coin is going over it, so I think the best way to deal with that is to treat the fingers as a separate patch themselves. So we're not going to focus on the fingers right now, we're only going to look at the palm area, because that's a more static area, and then we can just focus on different things at different times. So in the same way that we dealt with the background patch, I'm going to find a clean area of my hand that doesn't have the coin obscuring it. And I think the best frame for that is 176, because there's no coin obscuring it, and it's fairly close to right before the coin falls into it. What we're going to do is right after here, we'll create another frame hold. And we're going to create another copy with a roto with a fairly soft alpha that's going to be covering this palm area. The way I like to do my patches is I like to create a larger area than I needed to track on as a patch, because that helps me determine the shape and the movement of things. So I have different areas of reference, and then I can use that to use the plate to see where it needs to move as far as tracking is concerned. So in this example, I'm going to create a fairly large shape for the patch of my hand. Obviously the coin isn't going to cover this entire area, but now that I've covered a bigger chunk, when my hand moves, like here, I'll just merge it over. When my hand moves, I'll be able to easily determine the movement of my hand in relation to the patch because I've covered such a big area. My brain is able to tell where it needs to go. It's always nice to feather your patches too, because it'll help you mask the edges of where the patch is and it becomes less noticeable. Cool. The traditional way of doing a patch is you'd maybe want to track the hand using a 2D tracker or a mock-up tracker or something like that, but because the hand does move fairly quickly and in a sort of obscure way where it's distorting and everything, I think it's best in this case to do more of a manual track. The way you'd want to do that is you're just using a transform node. You'd want to create your first keyframe on the frame hold that you've done, because you don't want it to look any different on the actual reference frame that you have. And speaking of which, I think we'd want to go ahead and turn the patch off after 176 because there's no need for a patch after this frame. And because it doesn't change on 176, we can just turn it off over one frame. So now we're going to go backwards frame by frame and determine how the hand moves and then move the patch accordingly. And a good way to keep your patch from flickering and jittering a lot is to do it, instead of doing it frame by frame, you might want to do it over a couple of frames just so that you can let the software interpolate the movement. And then if it's still not accurate, you can go into the between keyframes and then adjust it manually. So in this case, I'm going to go back 2 frames, see how it's moved. And make the center of the transform here. And we can just slowly get it into place. What I'm using as a reference as to where I need to place the actual hand patch are these 3 lines here and the edges down here. So as long as they vaguely match up, we'll be in a good spot. And then at this point, because my palm is basically closed, I can just turn off the patch because we're going to deal with the little bit of the coin a bit as a separate thing. So it looks okay. I think we're like 50% of the way there. The next thing I wanted to try is see if we can isolate the coin more as more of an enclosed area so that our patch isn't such a huge thing. People approach this a few different ways. The merge node does come with a mask input, so that you can just purely mask where you want your patch to be using a rotor shape or anything like a key. This can be good, it's just I find it can confuse people who are picking up your script, and you want to make it very clear what you've done in your script just so there's no confusion. The other thing you can do is actually go into the copy node and change your alpha to look differently. You can completely delete the rotor shape and then make it more of a smaller alpha. Or you can actually just go in, create a merge node, set the operation to mask, and then use a rotor shape as a mask for it, basically. Which is effectively what the same thing is here, where you put the mask input in the merge node, but I just like to keep it all neat and keep it all separate. So it's up to you how you want to deal with that. So I want to go back to the frame here. And I want to see how much of the rest of this patch we can lose. Because all this stuff is not doing us a favor, because it looks slightly different to the plate. And it's very noticeable that there's a mat out there and it's affecting the rest of the plate. It just doesn't look very realistic. Now, if we isolate this patch around the coin vaguely, it'll help hide the fact that we've done a patch. And if you mask it and feather it, it'll make it look quite nice and soft. So that's how it looks now, and if we turn off the mask that we used, that's how it looks. So that's how much of the plate we're saving by doing a mask. And then what you want to do is sort of animate your rotor shape to follow this coin. And after this, we don't need the mask. Now, I should say this, that there is a slight danger to doing what I'm doing. You'll want to be very careful with this, because we're kind of lucky that this patch is a very quick one and the motion is very quick. When you have something that's more of a longer plate and your patch is a lot more detailed, and you do use a very intricate mask to basically mat out what you're patching, and it's moving around a lot over a steady plate, because you have a really detailed mask and it's moving all over the plate, and your patch isn't always going to look 100% accurate to what the plate is. That's just the nature of things. Because of that reason, you might notice a weird wiping roto mat going over your plate as like almost looking like a ghost. So you need to be very careful when using this technique. So going to the first frame here, we don't need to do anything. Going back a bit more, looks okay here, and then going back a little more, we noticed a little bit of shading discrepancy, but that could be because of the motion blur of the coin, so we're not going to do anything here. But then going one more frame back, I've noticed the hand has gotten a little darker. And that could be because I've started closing my hand, so it's blocking a bit of the light. The way we deal with this is you make your script a little bigger, and underneath your frame hold, before you do all your alpha work and any of your tracking, you can put in a grade node. Shortcut for that is G, or you can press tab and type grade here. So when you create a grade node, you don't want to just go in and try to eyeball what's going on. I mean, you can do it and you might get a decent result, but the way the professional guys do it is, instead of eyeballing it, what you can do is check out each channel, the RGB being the red, green, and blue, and matching the luminance of each color channel. So that'll give you more of an accurate result when it comes to matching the grade on things. Now, a cool trick you can do is if you press 1 on your patch and 2 on the plate area and press W, NUKE actually lets you do a wipe over where your patch is. So the two things you're looking at, you can do a wipe over like this. So it gives you this kind of nice line to use as a reference instead of a soft mat. So now if I look at the red-green channel, you can notice a lot of difference in the grading. And that's what we're going to use to help us with this. So first thing we're going to look at is the red channel. And if we gamma up and gain down and add some contrast to the plate, it'll help us be more accurate with the grading. So go here, you want to be touching the gain. We're probably not going to look at the gamma offset and all the black point, white point at this stage, because that's more of a different story. So just look at the gain. We're in the red channel, and then we're only going to be tweaking the red for now. And what we're going to do is try matching this darker color here. And because we have a good split line, it'll help us. Just try your best to match that color as good as you can. There. So now that we've done that, you'll notice that this area looks good, but then the rest of the area might look bad, and that's because we need to mask the grade itself. And we'll do that in a bit. There we go. And we're going to do the same thing with the green. As well as the blue. There we go. So now if you turn it on and off, you can see it's done a pretty decent job. and then we can press W again to get rid of the wipe. And now we need to see where the mask actually needs to go. So it's going to be more on this kind of center area where the light's really being blocked by the palm and the fingers. So create a rotor shape, connect it into the mask input of the grade, and then you can just do your best to determine where the grading needs to go. So now we've done that frame, we're going to go to the previous frame before that and then see how it's changed. And then what we're going to do is keyframe the grade node to match what happens later on. So if we create a keyframe on each of these RGB channels, we go back one, and then we're going to see, well, does it get darker, does it get lighter, or does it change color? And we can just deal with it that way. So after we've done the grading, we're going to play it again and see how it looks. So we've got marginally better. We've got the colors to look right. And now we should focus a little more on some of the distortion that's going on in the hand, because that's really going to help with the tracking. This would be a good moment to talk about the spline warp and how to use that. So spline warp, in essence, is just a rotor shape that you use to distort the image. So it creates a reference rotor shape that is locked, and then you can duplicate that rotor shape and then move it, and it'll remember the shape of the original spline and distort the image accordingly. So what you want to do is create a spline warp node, and the best place to put it is before any tracking that you've done. If you put it afterwards, it's not necessarily illegal. The only thing is then the actual spline warp won't move with what you've tracked. So if we've tracked this hand and we want the spline to stick to it, we want to put it before the actual transform, because it's going to remember all the values. Whereas if we put it afterwards, the spline itself is going to stay in place and then distort anything just where it is, whereas we want it to stick onto the patch. Here, so we slide it right there. And then we look at it, and what you want to do is basically create a rotor shape around the patch. So the spline warp node is almost basically like a roto node, because it'll let you create a rotor shape. And each individual point I'm making is where it's going to let me distort the actual image. So a good thing to do is just to keep the amount of points relatively minimal and just choose those important areas. So I'm choosing this side part of my palm where the line is, because I think that's where the most distortion is going to be, and then one on each end of the palm. I've made a little mistake here where I've created the first frame of the rotor on the spline warp different to the frame hole that I've done it on. So what I want to do is actually create the first frame of this rotor shape on the first frame of the patch. Otherwise it'll create some issues where the first frame of that patch will look different because I've distorted it, and then when I turn it off, it'll create this big flicker. So I'm going to go ahead and delete it and do it again. So now we're in a good spot, and what we can do now is go to the little table here that's got all the splines, right click your Bezier and go duplicate in A and join. So that'll create a duplicate of your shape, and the bottom one you want to lock. So that one will be locked in place and you won't be able to move it, but then the other one you'll be able to select, and when you do move it, it'll distort the image according to what the original shape of the spline was. And you want to be very subtle with how you do it, because if you move the spline warp too much, it'll get you a really distorted image and it can break some of the patchwork that you've done. Now, this is the area where my palm starts to squish on itself. So instead of moving the entire a bulk of the points as a whole, I'm starting to move parts of it individually. So it's letting me squish the patch in the same way that my hand is squishing. Now again, what I want to do is just play the patch. Okay, so it's looking a lot better now. So one thing I want to do first is I wanted to refine the shape of this patch. Because it doesn't cover this area of the hand, I think it'd be cool if we could cut along this line so that we'd be using the original plate. And it'll make the patch look a little more convincing. So the way I'd like to do that is I could totally use a key mix underneath my merge, or I could just use a merge node with a stencil operation underneath my patch here. So this will make it very clear to whoever picks up this script maybe in the future as to what I've actually done. They'll know that, okay, there's a stencil here, so clearly I'm cutting out something in this patch using a rotor shape. So as you can see, each thing we do, it's making the patch look a little more convincing. I think it's about time we deal with the wrinkle work now. So this is the part where it gets a little more up to you how you want to deal with this. So a lot of people like to use a Roto paint node and paint in their own shadows and be a little more creative with their work, or you could use a grade node with a mask input to define these lines here. And that's exactly what I'd like to do, just because that's how I like to do things. And before I do that, I'm just going to refine a little more of this grading that's going on, just to make it look a little more accurate to what's happening in the plate. So when you do this, you're going to want to make it very clear as to which grade node is doing what. So these first two ones, if we create a backdrop behind them, we can say shading for these. Just so if anyone else picks up this script, they'll know what's been done here. And the one below here, we can label it as lines. So the way I want to approach this is match the grade of these lines here with the grade node and then create a very thin shape to define how thick they are. And this takes a little bit of testing and just playing around with. I'm going to make a few more refinements before I go into the next area of what we're going to look into. And one thing I noticed is that the coin is going a bit over my fingers here and it's causing a bit of a shadow. So instead of creating a whole new patch, we can go in and start painting that manually. So I'm just going to go ahead and use the clone tool and carefully paint out the shadow and the edge of the coin by using a fairly soft brush. So we might need to go in and create a bit of a little wrinkle along this edge of the finger here as well, just in the same way that we did the lines. So I'm going to try using the exact same grade node and see if we can almost replicate the look of the wrinkles that go along the fold of the base of the finger. I'm actually going to do that underneath the paint that we've done rather than the patch, because we've painted over the patch. Now we're going to do the final few steps of this patch, and I think that's just that we need to roto the fingers going over my palm. So you can see there's a little bit of shadowing showing here. That's totally fine. We can go ahead and start painting in just the little details, just to make sure it's 100% clear. Now the last part of this is the fingers, and that's going to be done the exact same way that we did the hands, except I think this might be even a bit easier because it only lasts just about 1, 2, 3 frames. So I think we're in a good spot there. So now if we look at how the plate looks overall, looks like we've done a pretty good job of doing a coin magic trick. I think in the future I'm going to do a video on grain and all the attributes that come with it and how to actually apply grain to patches, but the reason I haven't done it in any of the videos now is because it's a little debatable as to which part of the pipeline it's done, whether it's done in the roto prep area or is it done in the comp area. So sometimes the way we work is we completely work on a degrain plate and then we provide our patch to the compers and they regrain the shots. Sometimes we do it ourselves. So it'll depend on where you go and where you work and how they want you to do it. So in the future, because it can get a little complicated, I'll do a video on how to do regraining on your patches. Yeah, I know this was a bit of a long one, but I guess it's necessary because I wanted to really fill in on how to look into the real little details and how to take your shot from 90% to 100%. This is the level of quality you'd be expected at maybe a bigger studio where they'll be really scrutinizing your work and checking every pixel. So I hope you enjoyed it. And if you got something out of it, please let us know in the comments. And if you want to see something more like this, let us know and subscribe to the channel. Thanks.